called each other by first names. In fact, some of them actually used pseudonyms, called themselves like Bob instead of their actual name. They thought it was kind of a fun little thing. Senator Aldrich, as they were debating about it at Jekyll Island, he wanted to call it the Aldrich Bill. He was kind of egotistical. Paul Warburg, however, wanted to call it the National or Federal Reserve Act. Aldrich won the battle, and he introduced the bill as the Aldrich Bill, but it was quickly identified as the Wall Street Bill, and the Republican majority never put it to a vote because they knew that we can't have this end, have people read it or whatever. So what the international bankers did, and this gets to an issue that I mentioned last week about controlling both parties and just kind of creating a fictitious conflict while masking what the real behind-the-scenes things are. But they went to Plan 2, which was the Democratic alternative, and backed Woodrow Wilson for president. And they created his party platform, which blatantly promised that there would be no centralized banks, no Wall Street-controlled centralized banks, should the Democrats win power. And but then the Democrats, they introduced the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, claimed that it was completely different from the Aldrich Bill. And the bankers, in fact, had even kind of put Senator Aldrich up to bash this bill, the Federal Reserve Act, to kind of sell that it was somehow different. But Paul Warburg, however, he very privately and secretly let everyone know, look, this bill and the Aldrich Bill, they're exactly the same, so no need to worry, because his friends were Wall Street bankers. And just before Christmas Eve, the day before Christmas Eve, it was signed by Woodrow Wilson. 3 years later, and I shared this quote last week, but I'll say it again because it's worth repeating. He lamented signing it and said, "We have come to be one of the worst ruled, one of the most completely controlled governments in the civilized world. No longer a government of free opinion, no longer a government by a vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men. Some of the biggest men in the United States in the field of commerce and manufacture are afraid of something. They know that there is a power somewhere, so organized, so subtle, so watchful, so interlocked, so complete, so pervasive, that they had better not speak above their breath when they speak in condemnation of it." He also said that I have unwittingly ruined my government. So, speaks highly of the Federal Reserve Act. I'm going to skip World War I. I'm not even going to get into World War II after this. But the Great Depression, to iterate the rowing of the economy that's been going on ever since the Goldsmiths, is after World War I, the national debt was 10 times greater than it was even after the Civil War. Debt generates a lot of revenue and a lot of national debt. In 1920, Republican Warren Harding was elected president, and he and Calvin Coolidge, what they did is they reduced income taxes because by this time the federal income tax, the IRS bill, basically was passed a few weeks before the Federal Reserve Act, same year. Not a very good year for politics. But they reduced income taxes, increased tariffs, and the economy just boomed. Now, the Federal Reserve, they didn't really want this, and international bankers didn't want this because it was a growth of the economy that was outside of their control. So what they did, just as with the Goldsmiths, is they increased the money supply. They made it very, very easy for people to get loans, get money, and so they had the nation strung out on credit, and businesses in particular. And then in April of 1929, Paul Warburg, who, as I mentioned earlier, he was at Jekyll Island. He was actually the author of the Federal Reserve Act. He let his friends know quite secretly that a Great Depression was imminent, or was certain, sorry. And it's interesting to note that the biographies of John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, Joseph Kennedy, and a whole bunch of other Wall Streeters, they all marvel at how they were able to get out of the stock market just before the crash happened. Amazing coincidence. An important thing to note is that in times of depression, wealth is not lost. it is simply transferred and consolidated in fewer and fewer hands. For example, Joseph Kennedy's worth went from $4 million in 1929 to $100 million just about 6 years later. That's quite an increase, I think. So, on October 24th, 1929, the big New York bankers called in what's known as their 24-hour broker call-in loans, which meant that brokers had to drop all of their stocks. They had to sell all of their stocks regardless of the price so that they could pay in these loans that had been called in. And Curtis Dahl, who was the son-in-law of FDR, in a book that he wrote in the 1970s, explained that the Great Depression, actually, it was the calculated shearing of the public by the world money powers, triggered by the planned sudden shortage of call money in the New York money market. So basically, that these centralized bankers had created the Great Depression. And Milton Friedman, who's a Nobel Prize-winning economist, said in an NPR interview in January of '96 that the Federal Reserve definitely caused the Great Depression by contracting the amount of currency in circulation from 1929 to 1933 by a third. So, it gets into that rolling cycle. And also that the Great Depression wasn't caused by a stock market crash. The stock market crash was simply a smokescreen in the veil, and it's been used in history books, which, as I've already mentioned, are controlled by these same people. And it diverts you from the actual cause, which is the central bank, which most people don't even realize is completely private. Now, another thing of interest to me is you have Fort Knox. Does Fort Knox have gold in it? Okay, well, some of you are shrugging your shoulders. It has gold in it, but does that gold belong to the U.S.? Answer is no. In 1933, all monetized gold was to be collected from citizens, and it was purchased at $20 per ounce. Now, there was a penalty of 10 years imprisonment if you kept your monetized gold. So if I kept a single gold coin and said, I'm not going to sell this to you, government, the government can go, okay, well, here's your fine, and here's your 10 years in jail, because I didn't want to give up my gold, which was my property. But anyway, by 1935, all gold was confiscated, and 2 years after that, in 1937, Fort Knox had been completed, and all the gold was stationed there. Now, an interesting note about Fort Knox, in case none of you watch the History Channel as I did when I had cable. The Fort Knox is the tank training ground for the U.S. military. If you want to learn about tanks, driving tanks, commanding them, all of that, you go to Fort Knox. Pretty good place to store gold, I think, because you have this tank infantry. But it housed 700 million ounces of gold, which was about 70% of the world's complete gold supply at the time. And now that was in 1913, or 1937, sorry, too many dates. Now, once all the gold was collected though, gold was allowed to be sold from Fort Knox. Trick is that it wasn't allowed to be sold to U.S. citizens because it was illegal for U.S. citizens to own it. The value of gold rose from $20 to $35 per ounce, and it was sold to foreigners. And in fact, the Firestone family had set up many dummy corps in Europe in order to purchase some of this gold, and unfortunately for them, the plot was discovered and they were successfully prosecuted. Though I don't think they're doing so bad, I think their tires are everywhere. But in '71, Nixon finally repealed the Gold Act, and you were allowed to own gold once again. Isn't that wonderful? Now, when Fort Knox was created, it was originally said that an audit has to take place every year. I mean, you have the wealth of the nation, over 70% of the world's wealth, and it hasn't been audited since 1953, and it was only audited in 1953, because Eisenhower, the president at the time, demanded it so. Audits had not been going on there on a regular basis. So there was clearly some nefarious activities going on. Now, one other interesting aspect about Fort Knox to me is I was listening to a radio program, it's called Radio Liberty, and they were talking about money, and in particular gold. And